Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Shireen Kostropour. I'm a psychology professor at ACC and I'm director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at Austin Community College. And on behalf of my colleague Leila Taragi and my colleague Mark, from whom you will hear soon, I wanted to welcome you. I know it's getting close to the end of the semester and we have a lot going on, so we doubly appreciate having you here. I used to give a more detailed introduction to our participants, but I have learned that you prefer hearing from them directly, so I won't say very much about Ann Lewis. Other than to just, read the last thing she said in her bio that she sent us that really speaks volumes about her work, is that her intent to create meaningful work, tell the truth about the working class Americans, and contribute to the vitality of independent filmmaking. So we are grateful for her being here discussing this really profoundly impactful film. Kind of unpacking some of that for us. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Mark Cunningham, who will introduce himself and then turn it over with questions to Ann.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Mark Cunningham. I'm a professor in the radio, television, and film department at Austin Community College. I teach courses in intro to radio, television, and film, intro to cinema, and media literacy. I am, as most people here probably know, but for those who don't, I am currently engaged with doing rewrites on a book I'm trying to get finished. Hopefully I'll be able to submit after Christmas break on John Singleton and his films, Boys in the Hood, Poetic Justice, and Baby Boy. A book that I'm writing for Columbia University Press's imprint Wallflower. So I'm excited both excited and will be relieved when that's done. So, so that's who I am. I'm going to turn it over to our discussant today, Ann Lewis. So Ann, if you could tell us something about yourself, it'd be great.
Sure. So I'm right now, what I'm doing is teaching at UT Austin. I teach mainly film editing, and I teach it at upper division level. So one of the things that I was asked to do is talk a little bit about education and my understanding of ACC, which is, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful way to do lower division, particularly if some of my best students are out of the community college system. And my own kid went 2 years to ACC and then moved on to UT and has a master's now in social work. So I think it's a wonderful way to get an education. I think, and it's really, really important to the community. Personally, I got my degree when I was 50 years old. So, just know that it is not something that people always go straight through. All kinds of things happen along the way, like children and moves and relationships and making films and all kinds of things. So I'm still also making films. I think always my favorite film is the one that I did last or that I'm working on now. But my latest one is about Raul Arcelinas, who is a local poet. It's all about East Austin. It's a kind of a jazz experimental documentary, and I'm sure we'll show it a lot around town. So that's with me and Laura Varela working as directors together. Harlan County was something that I did when I was about your age. And while it's not my film, it's Barbara Kopple's film, there is no film that belongs to one person. We're always working in teams. So it's a very important kind of thing for us to acknowledge all the people that work on any film. So on Harlan County, I was the associate director and assistant camera person, and our crew was at most 4 people, sometimes 3 people. So you're talking about very directly involved. In fact, I have a little cameo in the film, which is serving a warrant. Looked very different then.
Nice. Oh, that's awesome. Well, hopefully everyone had a chance to see Harlan County prior to this discussion. And if not, I strongly urge you after this to please check this film out. I think it is one of the most important films ever made. And I think it's one of the best documentaries ever made, honestly. It is just a moving piece of work, and about how the system, works against certain people, but how those people come together, right, to assert themselves and to demand their rights. And that there's not much, there's a lot, it's one of the most important things we can do, I think, as citizens in this country, for sure. So just to start off, and I'd like to ask you, what do you believe the role of documentary filmmaking to be as it pertains to like chronicling historical events, influencing us as a culture?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how few labor struggles have been documented. And that really concerns me, or have been documented and then achieved the kind of distribution and fame that Harlan County has. I think that's very interesting. There's a book by Tom Zanielli, and I keep forgetting the name of it, but it's a great book. It's really funny. The title ends with riffraff, which I would, I like that. But one of the points he makes is that most of the films about labor have been made by women, which is really interesting. So this kind of people's history, what's not the history of war, like Ken Burns' Civil War or whatever, but the historical chronicling or documentaries about perceptions of history or events has been very limited, I think, to away from a kind of a people's history. It's been much more what goes on with important people making decisions about things, rather than the collective force of people down at the bottom of the economic ladder. And I, personally, I think that's all that's important. That's who makes change in this country, not that's who should be making change in this country, at least. So for me, that's a terrible absence. And, and I hate that Ken Burns is all by himself being public television these days, chronicling war from a very, somewhat arrogant level, I think. I don't like Ken Burns. And I'm not the only person that doesn't like Ken Burns. I hate to express opinions.
I've heard some things myself too.
There's a very good essay by Eric Foner at the end of Who Owns History, which just blasts Ken Burns' coverage of the aftermath of the Civil War.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, it's really interesting, like you said, like who gets preferenced, right, to kind of tell these stories. And Ken Burns, you're right, is everywhere. I mean, it's probably the one documentarian most people know if you ask them, because of his ubiquitous, ness, if you will.
Right. And, the film that I made before this it chronicles two labor events in Texas history, both of them victories. And I know that nobody's heard of one of them, which is Annie Mae Carpenter is not going to ring a bell in Nacogdoches for anybody, because the event is she was an African-American woman at Stephen F. Austin State University who refused to clean the men's dormitory bathrooms and got fired. And then it became a massive uprising in Nacogdoches with 3,000 people marching through in the late 80s. It's an incredible story. that nobody knows. The other one is Emma Tenayuka, who's on all of these murals. But again, this is a walkout in San Antonio in the 30s of 10,000 pecan shellers. Many of them undocumented, all of them, young, old women, and they walked out, and they also won their strike. So again, a history, people may know Emma Tenayuka's name, but most people don't, but certainly not that history, which is really, really important, Texas history. But instead we know all about, Elon Musk or something that's not inspirational and kind of sad and tragic more than anything else. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting, bro. So so let's talk a little bit about Harlan. At the beginning of the film, we see an interview with a former miner who kind of talks about the mining company, them cautioning him to protect this mule that's being used for the job because of the monetary value of the mule, and then had no real response when he asked the question, well, what about me? And the fact that he learned very quickly, right, that they preference the value or the life of the mule over his own life. So how do you think this scene and the information in it serve as a sort of thesis for what Barbara Kopple wants us to learn about what she shows us or depicts for us in Harlan County, USA?
Well, I think that's just a crucial point. The former miner is Nimrod Workman, who would have celebrated his, I think, 100th birthday fairly recently. So I've just been thinking about him. He won a National Heritage Award for his singing. He was a singer. He was, I believe he's mainly Native American from West Virginia. Chattaroy, West Virginia was his home, and he was just a wonderful, wonderful man, just full of life and spirit, and connected to all of the progressive movements in that area. So when he tells that story, it's a kind of a classic story. I mean, you could hear it any number of times with slightly different telling, but it's one of those ones that's, throughout the region is told quite a bit by older miners. He was actually around when they used mules, which is different. But again, it's this question of devaluing people. I mean, you can see people, spending more money on a piece of machinery than on human beings now, or caring more about their piece of machinery than they cared about the human being that was running it, because the human being was cheaper. I think it's a common feeling among workers still. Not just in the mines, but among people. Oh, I forgot to mention when I was introducing myself, I'm still very active in labor unions. So, so this question of individual workers having absolutely no power to affect change and needing to, in some way, create solidarity with each other, I think is critical. So I think it informs the whole piece. I think it's a wonderful kind of analogy. It seems a little remote in a way because we don't think of working, of mules underground, but
Right.
I feel for the mule too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, but in looking at it, to start it out that way, right? And on one hand, right, the story, when he tells it, it's a pretty funny story, the way that he tells it, right? And then, the credits come up, for the film, and you start thinking like, oh man, like, what are we in for, right? When you watch this, and and I watched it again last night, and I've seen it, as I told you, multiple times, and it just still hits me every time that like, this is not going to be an easy story. I mean, based on that story that he tells, even though he tells it very humorously. Yeah, right. For sure. So, one of my favorite people in this film, as I told you, is Lois Scott, who headed up the women, the kind of the organized the women, right, in helping their husbands and their sons and brothers and friends secure union contracts. And I love it in the film when she says, there's a moment in the film, it's kind of probably a bit of an aside for some people, but I caught it. And she says very quickly to let your conscience be your guide. And then she says right after that I never run. I never run.
Right.
So, how do you think that represents the overall theme of the narrative and what you all were up against as crew members making this film?
Right. I think the people were amazing. And Lois was certainly amazing. She was not a miner's wife. She did not live in Brookside. She lived in the neighboring town. Her daughter, who that has some very explicit language for Basil Collins at one point, which I just felt like, oh, I'm going to die right here on the spot, but she was saying some things to him very directly. There was a miner's wife, a Brookside miner's wife. So Lois was coming over in support. Lois was, is a big woman, tough woman, who was always involved. She was involved in everything in her community. She was the person that went to the PTA and decided, man, this isn't really representing kids. I'm going to take it over. She was the one. She was involved in everything, and she was strong and righteous. And when she says, "Let your conscience be your guide," I know this is peace and conflict, but she wasn't always the most peaceful person in the world. Although I don't think I never saw her actually commit an act of violence. Honestly, I never did. But she wasn't afraid of violence. She would confront it. And she said that after this very dramatic scene in the movie, but in real life too. Earlier that day, where we had been attacked, everybody on the picket line was attacked by folks, and physically attacked. And so she was like, we got to defend ourselves because nobody else was going to defend us. So it was a statement of self-defense.
Yeah. Speaking of that attack, that's another question I wanted to ask you about. I mean, in my opinion, I don't know how others feel about this, but it always has been with this movie, one of the most chilling scenes in this movie is that shot of Basil Collins in that truck pointing that gun at you all and at you. Yes. At you. I watched the making of documentary, and when you said it was pointed at you. Yes, absolutely. And and then the assault takes place on you all, and Barbara talks about, being kicked and, swinging her bike and trying to fend them off. I was going to ask you to speak to that moment a little bit for us. Like aside from the events that were happening, kind of like what provoked him at that moment for them to do that, because they were already riled up but at that moment to attack you all like that.
Well, should I tell the whole story?
Yes, please.
I saw it. So this is something that happens very early in the morning, which a lot of, what happened on the picket line, because shift change was very early in the morning. So this is when the strikebreakers or scabs would come through the picket line to work in the mine where all the regular workers were on strike. So it was a moment always of great tension. And like I said, I was pretty young. I think I was 24 or 25 at the time. And one of my jobs was to hold the lights. And we had these lights called sun guns. And they're very high intensity lights. And the DP positioned me at the edge of this bridge leading over. And he positioned me in a way where I was basically blinding Basil Collins. So I'm holding these lights up above my head like that, and Basil Collins can't see behind me, and I realize it right at that moment that he's not pointing a gun at me at all. Really, he's just really worried that he's being ambushed. So he pulls out a gun, and it was very close to me, physically. And I'm like, I'm basically doing isometrics, trying to get these lights away from my head, because I know that that's what he's angry about. And I think maybe he'll just shoot the lights out and everything will be okay. But it was like one of those moments of real, suddenly being conscious of what's going on in a very slow, methodical way. And then they all go across the bridge, and that morning, rather than just going to work, they all got clubs and stuff, and they came back across the bridge at us, and they hit not me but the lights, knocked them out. So everything's now happening in the dark, and it's terrifying. And in the film, you hear these screams. And what was going on was Bill Worthington, who was African American and on the picket line, and very deeply involved in something called the Black Lung Association, which was about occupational disease, had a young intern, a woman that was going to be a lawyer. And Bill had his gun out, and Basil Collins had his gun out, and they were walking down the highway together with guns pointed at each other. And she honestly had no idea what to do. So she began just screaming at the top of her lungs. And that's what you're hearing. It sounds like somebody is being hurt, but in fact, she's just terrified. And then there were people hurt. There were people hit over the head with those pipes and stuff. We, as a film crew, were not particularly hurt. The sun guns were damaged, but as you can tell, the camera was okay and everything, we were okay. And Barbara did swing her microphone at these guys. And eventually they just decided that enough was enough, and they you can hear all these lead pipes and stuff dropping to the ground, and Basil motions them across the bridge, and they just all went across the bridge again. So that was that day, but it was a very intense experience, and it's what produces the next day, which was this picket line that was very interesting, where my cameo is, because I got very huffy and indignant and filed a warrant on Basil Collins, went down to the city and filed a warrant and said, this guy shoved a gun in my face, Wow. So that's why the car gets, what the whole confrontation with the sheriff the next day is about. But that was why I that's why I filed the warrant. And then I ended up getting arrested for willfully attempting to block a public highway, which is, a felony in retribution, I got hauled down and fingerprinted, and all of it was dropped when the strike was won.
Man, I mean, that scene, it just always sticks with me, because I think it's the way that it's shot. It seems like it's almost like in slow motion when he's driving by and pointing at
it is.
It is. Yeah. And
it is in slow motion. It's exactly the way it felt at the time.
I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, it just sticks out. It's just amazing. Like, even in the trailer, like that's one of the final shots in the trailer, that moment, because it just kind of speaks to, like, again, just so much about what you all were up against, as not only them on the picket line, but you all as crew members there with them trying to chronicle this story. And it just, that's a great story to hear. I mean, not at the time, I'm sure, but it's great to hear you relay it, for sure.
Well, it all came out okay, right?
Yeah, it did. It all came out good. It did. You mentioned you were talking about Bill Worthington, but more so, I wanted to ask about race relations in this struggle, actually. I mean, there are a few instances in the film where we see some Black miners there, and in particular when Basil Collins calls one of them the N-word. And I think it's Lois, maybe, that hollers back, "He's a better man than you'll ever be," that she says. What did you notice about race relations when you were shooting?
Yeah, well, it's hard for me to separate when I was shooting from, living there for
Oh, okay.
25
Well,
years.
well, yeah.
So basically, Eastern Kentucky, that part of Eastern Kentucky is about, well, it used to be about 99% white.
Mhm.
Now, at a certain point, what's interesting is at a certain point, a third of the workforce in that area, in the coal mines, was African American.
Mm.
A third of it. So there's a history of African Americans in those mining areas. And it's a very strong history. And the Mine Workers Union was one of the few unions that actually did not have segregated locals. So you can see pictures of black miners and white miners together. And the big, it's not that there wasn't racism. There was plenty of racism, but the big joke was, well, we all look the same anyway after the shift. So, that was kind of, some of the language. In fact, there was particularly from the mine owners, but also a certain amount from the union. There was racism involved. Um, Black miners got worse jobs, at least until the union came in. When the union came in, it was really a force for much less racism in the workforce. And so the union was a really powerful anti-racist force
Mm.
in the mines. So there's all that history. And there were still, at that time, towns or areas of coal camps that were Black. The coal camps, the housing was very segregated.
Mhm.
It wasn't just Black, white, but it was also some places had Eastern European, had Czech miners or Hungarian miners, and they
Mm.
were all in their little parts of the camp, and it was illegal to go from one part of camp to another because they really wanted to use those divisions to keep
Wow.
the workforce from unionizing.
Wow.
And Black miners actually were brought in from northern Alabama, mainly,
Mhm.
um, Birmingham area as well, to break strikes. But a lot of them ended up joining the unions, and you can see, particularly in West Virginia, Black leadership in locals that were
Mhm.
mixed race.
Wow.
So,
Yeah, that's something also that from another time. I saw that John Sayles, the great John Sayles,
yeah, yeah,
and made one, but
yeah.
his movie Made One depicts that happening, what you're describing. It's so funny how like that was the case. I'd like to say he's chronicling something that happened way earlier than what you're describing, but it's the same practice.
It really was true all the way up through the 50s. And then the union was broken, and many, there's something called the East Kentucky Social Club, which is really cool.
Mm.
And what it is all of these people were basically forced out because they were the last hired. And so they went to major cities. They went to LA, they went to, they went to New York, they went to Boston. And the East Kentucky Social Club is this gathering of people from like Lynch, Kentucky or Benham, Kentucky, these little coal camps in Kentucky. It's and they get together in these major cities. And what's also interesting is how very well a lot of those people have done.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing. I didn't know any of that. I mean, outside, that's amazing. That's an
But it's
education.
but it's also, I mean, there's also Klan stuff in Eastern Kentucky, and Eastern Kentucky is now very reactionary. It's changed, so even since I left there. At the time of Harlan County USA, there were still communities, Black communities, um, throughout that area. And so those Black miners were coming, I think from Benham probably, over to the picket line to support miners. And then Bill Worthington was somebody who'd lived in Harlan County forever, had worked in the mines, had become a great grassroots leader in this fight about occupational health and safety,
Hmm.
and a
Yeah.
well respected member of the community.
Wow. Man. So now I got to read up on all of this afterwards. 'Cause this is amazing. It's
Yeah, there's
amazing.
some great scholars. I'll send you their
No,
books.
please.
Yeah. You know, there's somebody that's actually living in Texas right now that I'll send you.
Yeah.
I'll
That's-
send you some info about
I
that.
would love to. That's amazing. This is incredible. Wow. Could you talk a little more about the role of the women in this fight for the union contracts? You know, in particular, how influential were they in terms of being able to help these men, you know, achieve these union contracts, particularly given some of the patriarchal attitudes that were prevalent at the time? Like I think about the scene where the one guy's talking about, we're surprised to see our women out here
Yeah,
acting like this. And I was like, what? You know, but yeah.
yeah. So eh, let's see. I don't know quite how to begin. So I don't know if you all have seen the film Salt of the Earth.
Yeah.
Um,
We actually did
which is
what
about
Salt of
New
the Earth is. We did it for one of our screenings for
Oh,
this
great.
last year. Yeah, last time. Yeah, last year.
Oh,
Last year.
wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I think that that the women created an auxiliary, I still have a jacket somewhere, was a women's auxiliary from Brookside. But the miners' wives created an auxiliary was because we brought that film and showed it, and people just kind of picked up on it. But women were very involved from the beginning, and so what happened was they created injunctions on who could be on picket lines. So you could only have 3 of the miners on picket lines. And so what happened was women were they couldn't form injunctions against women being on the picket line because they didn't work in the mines at that time. Later on, there was a real movement for women to get into coal mines, but at that time there weren't any women in that mine particularly. So they so they came out to form the picket line because it was illegal for men to be on the picket line.
Mm.
So then you begin seeing the strength of women defending really community values. I mean, the union is a lot more than getting a pay raise or something like that. It directly impacts the health of the community. It impacts housing. It impacts everything. It impacts poverty. It impacts so the union fight. It impacts health and safety. So the union fight became a fight of everyone, not just the working miners. And so they were out, and they were incredibly powerful. And I think, that's something that really is very important in the film. I think, the other thing is things change in editing a lot, and actually men did play a pretty strong role in the strike as well.
Mhm.
I mean, they were not, stepping to the background while women did all the work. They were definitely out there too, and doing a lot of things.
Yeah, those women, like I say, are just incredible and breathe, I think, so much energy, I feel, into this film. I particularly like the scene where the women kind of get into it with each other and talk about who's sleeping with whose husband, and all this. They have that moment where that happens to them, and then Sudi, is that, I forget her, Castleberry?
Yes, Sudi Crusenberry.
Crusenberry, yeah, who makes it seem, but and she said, if somebody runs off with my man, fine, I don't care. I'm here about the union contract. But then she tells this really poignant story about, not being as educated as she would have liked to have been, and all that, which I thought it takes this turn for her. What was she like, Sudi? I know we talked a lot about.
It's wonderful. I mean, they all were, even the people that were on the wrong side in that little argument. I mean, Frida No is one of the women that's really being catty, and
Yeah.
and she was a wonderful union woman too. I mean, the older woman there would like cook for us all the time. I mean, it was like they were an amazing community of people. Um, and Sudi was just absolutely great, and I loved that the film. I didn't edit the film; I did some of the rough cutting,
Mhm.
but I love that that scene is in there because it's so authentic. Because it shows, that people can resolve differences.
Mhm.
I mean, because the next day everybody was out there on the picket line
Right.
together,
Yeah.
so maybe you need to have a little conflict and a little struggle and call each other names occasionally. Maybe it's necessary, but it just makes things very authentic for me, because that's really what it's like, right? I mean, even among friends there are times when you bicker, right?
Mhm. And you're right. And you're right. They do. They resolve that issue amongst them. And it doesn't last very long. I mean, for what we see on the film anyway, but it,
Oh,
it doesn't take
yeah.
it. Yeah, yeah, it doesn't last very long. They get past it because they get back to the heart of what's important, right?
Right,
And about what they're doing. And it's
right.
so
It would be a great film to show for conflict resolution. I mean, a
yeah.
great scene in
Yeah.
itself, because
Mhm.
it is the way that conflict sometimes gets resolved is by somebody who's been in the background, coming to the foreground and saying, wait a moment, y'all. you
Yeah.
know?
There's a bigger, yeah. Who cares about the husbands? Like if they want to walk over, like, and Sudi kind of changed the direction of that whole conversation. It died after she did that. It was amazing
Right.
watching that occur.
It's interesting for me because it's similar to what happens with a preacher after Lawrence Jones is killed,
Yeah.
which is another scene where you watch conflict be resolved,
Mhm. Oh
um,
yeah.
which is unusual, I think. So in some ways, it is on an internal level. It is about how do you resolve conflict, not just between workers and a company, but
Mhm.
also how do you maintain solidarity? How do you resolve conflict within your own group,
Yeah.
which is which is really much harder in a lot of ways. I mean, it demands more of you. Uh,
Mhm.
you get a contract that that's the end of the. You go back to work.
Yeah.
Maybe you haven't resolved, or maybe you just never do resolve those bigger
Mhm.
societal conflicts, but you have to resolve the conflicts uh, at, within your group,
Right. Yeah. It's
or
when you
you're
mentioned,
really going to lose.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and that would they. I love that scene, like you mentioned with the preacher, right, when he gets up there and he says, if there was any time that we're going to, you know, I forget the word specifically. They say, calm yourself down. Well, this will be the time to do it, right? And
Hold your
he
peace. He
hold
uses
your
the
peace.
term
Yes,
hold your peace.
hold your
Yeah.
peace. He said this will
Yeah.
be the time to hold it. Like, and I also too love, because I was going to ask you to speak a little bit about Lawrence Jones's murder. I mean, he had this, he was 23, 24, and he had this 16-year-old wife and child, and then he's murdered on the line. And I remember, that preacher also saying, that man saying that, I wish it had been me, somebody who's I'm on my way out anyway. I've lived my life, and it takes somebody this young to do that. But yeah, but I thought that, particularly Lawrence's life that way, but dying for what he believed in, and his mother. We see that scene of her passing out at his funeral, but she's saying before that, I wanted all my children to be Union men, like very proud of what he had done and stuff. But could you talk a little bit about the events that surrounded Lawrence's murder?
Well, I think it's complex. I mean, I don't think it's one. I don't think people go out to die for a union, or any other thing.
Mhm.
I mean, they're willing to take chances, but I don't think people go out for that reason. And I think in this situation there were multiple reasons why that happened. I went back and kind of tried to figure out what had happened. I went to the grand jury after that, and nobody was, and Bill Bruner, who had shot Lawrence Jones, was not charged because there was gunfire back and forth. You know, I think that it's, again, quite complex, but I think what's really interesting is what then happens.
Mhm.
Because what in fact happened, which is not really in the film. I mean, the film, if you ask how they won, you would say they won by sticking it out. And that would be true. That would be true. And important. And probably the right answer. But at that point, the government intervened. The US government intervened on the side of the miners.
Really?
Because at that time, the coal industry was much more organized. And there was a national contract coming up. And the country's very dependent on coal. I mean, you know, people are fighting here in Austin to get the Fayette coal plant closed. It's like, you know, when you turn on your light, it's got a certain component of coal going in there. So this is really core stuff. And these guys that seem remote and seem like, oh, why should anybody care about them, are in fact at the core of what's running our economy, you know, at that time. So it was very important that it not turn into a major battle. And that, because every coal miner in the country would have walked out if they hadn't gotten a contract.
Wow. Man.
So, you know, so you have this big, this little thing in this remote part of the country becoming very, very important to the entire economy of the country, which shows you the potential power of working people, right?
Right. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think about that scene too. It reminds me of that scene when they go to New York and they're on Wall Street, and I think it's Jerry Johnson.
Jerry Johnson, yeah.
That talks to the police officer, and that's such a great conversation. I'm glad that's in the film too, right? They talk about, because it really showed just sometimes how people are out of touch and they don't realize how much they're dependent upon, like you said, that working class, even though he's a working man himself as a police officer, but he was talking about like, oh, and Jerry kind of points out all these lights here, people don't realize how that, you know, that's because of what we do. Right. And how that distinction between, you know, how much people don't know and how reliant we are on what these miners are doing.
Right. And what's really funny is the cop says, this is what I do. It's bullshit. It's really funny. The behind the scenes on that one is Jerry had, the cop didn't realize that the conversation was being recorded, I don't think, because there was no visible microphone. The camera was there, but cameras weren't attached to microphones in those days. They were separate. And Jerry had a little hidden microphone under his placard.
Oh.
And so he's like, if you look at the footage and know that, you can see him trying to hold, the wind's blowing it, and he's trying to keep the microphone hidden. But it's just this wonderful, funny conversation about like medical benefits and, you know, pay and
He's like, Jerry's like, he goes, yeah, I get dental. Jerry's like, you get dental? He's like, man, you know. And I thought that, but you know, I thought that was so poignant, because I hope this doesn't sound shallow, but I found myself this go around watching the film, paying attention to their health and looking at their teeth and like how things like that, those needs were not being met for them. And so when Jerry hears that he has dental, and Jerry kind of goes, what? Like,
Yeah, yeah, and the cop says, "Yeah, I got drugs."
yeah. And he's like, what?
It's just a spoof on that poor cop, you know.
Yeah, that cop was just like, and then the fact too that he even asked, like, oh, I thought this was y'all's first day out here. Jerry's like, no, this is 9 months.
Yeah, yeah,
We've been fighting for this.
yeah. And the cop says, "Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you're up here getting attention to it."
Yeah, he's like, what did I say about that? Yeah, like, yeah, it's such a, it's, yeah, you're right. It's funny too, but it's such a great scene because it just shows, right? Like you said again, how most of us as citizens just are so unaware of these basic things that we take for granted, like what it really takes to get those things.
Right.
We don't pay attention to that. No, man. Yeah, it's a great scene. It really, really is.
Funny.
It is. I want to tell you a little bit about the music in the film. Of course, you get that great scene with Florence Reece setting up which side are you on, and then Hazel Dickens, of course, is a lot of the music here. And the music to me seems to be like another character in this film. You know, how important do you feel like these protest songs were, not only kind of enhancing the film's narrative, but as an influence on the struggle around unionizing?
Well, again, there's this wonderful history, you know, of song and, you know, and movement. You know, and it's true in the labor movement with all the wobbly songs, and you know, it's just there's just a wealth of music that we don't know very well. Um, you know, Billy Bragg does it kind of punk style. It's fun. It's really worth listening to. Uh, uh, but this is very authentic mountain music, sung very much the way it was sung all along by Hazel, who's from West Virginia and lived in Baltimore, went to work in factories, and then became a singer-songwriter. But she's writing about the explosion at the Mannington mine. She's writing about black lung, and she's writing about it from somebody whose brother has black lung or father dies of black lung, that kind of relationship to it. Florence Reece was still living in East Tennessee at that time. So she was living, you know, an hour and a half away from Harlan County. So it's very easy to get her to the rally. I think Bill Worthington sings "This Little Light of Mine" at one of the rallies. There's just a lot of really there was a lot of music, but I think that's true of the civil rights movement. You know, any of these really wonderful movements. It's even true of the anti-Vietnam War movement. You know, some of the stuff that we think of as kind of 60s psychedelic music was also protest music. Certainly Bob Dylan's stuff is all very much protest music. So I think that just kind of comes with the turf, that when people are trying to create solidarity and create community and create some courage, singing a song together really works pretty well.
Yeah, those songs are so amazing. I was listening to them this time, you know, as I do when I watch this movie, and the storytelling in them are amazing. I mean, they're relaying this history and giving you this information, right? In addition to, you know, kind of rallying the troops, if you will. It does so much, that music does, and like you say, and I think part of the charm of it also too is the voices aren't polished, right? They aren't. It's not technically whatever. It's so heartfelt and so you know, just real, absolutely real.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great stuff. And Hazel was a wonderful, wonderful woman. So was Florence Reece, but I knew Hazel better than I knew Florence Reece.
Man, it's amazing you like knew all these people. I mean,
Yeah, it's really cool, actually.
very cool. It is. I mean, John Sayles, there's on the Criterion channel, the stuff for Harlan County. There's John Sayles talks about it for a while, and he mentions hearing Hazel Dickens in the movie, and like, who is that? right? And then getting her for Matewan, his
Yeah,
film.
which is terrific.
It
I mean,
is.
I really like Matewan.
It's a brilliant movie. I like that movie a lot too. It's a great film. If y'all haven't seen Matewan, see Matewan.
But it won't leave you happy.
No, it will not.
Harlan County leaves you kind of happy, at least.
I agree.
I saw Matewan in a union hall, and this organizer at the end of the film said, "Now, don't that just make you feel grand?"
Because it does not end nice. It does not end.
It makes you just want to go out and organize. And he was saying it very sarcastically, but
that is very true. You're right about that. Harlan County does, despite the heaviness of its subject matter, it does end on a bright note. There is a hopeful note at the end of it, which is good, right? Because so much that's dour that happens in it. And so it does end on this great note. That's a very, very good point. No, yeah, Matewan will not do that. Absolutely, it will not. How much over the years, how much do you think that Harlan County USA, the film, has helped influence union organization or brought awareness to similar plights concerning the working class?
I think it's really important. I can't think of other films about labor. There are some very good ones. There are some really good labor films out there, by the way. This one everybody looks at in the labor movement at some point or other. Just about everybody. It's used a lot to examine strategy and tactics and stuff like that. It's been important within the labor movement, but I'm very curious about it because I think when we were working on it, we never thought that it was going to become anything much. I mean, it was going to be a film and it was going to be a good film, but that's usually as far as you go on anything. Right. At least that's as far as I go. So it's been very interesting. And I asked a film studies class once about why on earth this very remote, really not very important. I mean, whether the Brookside strike was won or lost doesn't really matter in the broad scheme of things, It's a very minor thing in a very remote place with people that have been stereotyped, actually, rather than admired. And yet it's captured all of this attention.
Yeah.
And I am somewhat mystified by it, to be honest.
Really? Why?
Well, it's not. Well, I don't understand it. I mean, I think it's a very good film, but it's unique in that it's the exception that proves the rule.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I thought about, even in the fact in watching it, and it's clearly taking place in the 70s, but it just still, it's so impactful, and those, those issues that get brought up in that film, or that are brought up in that film, are interestingly still relevant. Shouldn't be, unfortunately, right? Still relevant in so many ways, right? That we're still not treating working class people any better in this country.
Right. I made a film about fast food workers in Eastern Kentucky in the 90s, early 90s. And I swear that thing actually just played in Tennessee again. And it was like, it was like tomorrow, it could be tomorrow morning, in terms of pay levels and the need to unionize. But I find it very interesting that the film did so well.
And it continues to resonate like it does. I mean,
Yeah.
you all
I'm
won
very
the Oscar.
glad, I think it's wonderful that it does. I mean, I wish that that was true of a lot of other films that are really, really good
Yeah.
and about that kind of struggle or, yeah.
Yeah, you all, I mean, y'all won the Oscar for your efforts.
Yeah.
And I love watching the making of and Barbara talking about how happy they were in Harlan County about the fact we won, and they were very happy about that.
Well, that's not quite true.
Can you tell
No,
us
people
what
were
is true?
deeply, a lot of people were embarrassed by the film in Harlan County.
Really, why?
Well, it was pretty intimate. I mean, it exposes their poverty. If they weren't involved in the strike, which most people weren't,
Mm.
would you be proud of not being involved?
Oh,
Uh, oh, seriously. I mean, it was, there were people that were very unhappy with the film.
wow.
I think Barbara didn't live there, and I did.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw it probably for, the next 25 years. I had some sense of it. People in the region, a lot of people didn't even know about it, never saw it.
Wow.
I mean, it was much more well known. I worked for a group in Eastern Kentucky called Apple Shop, which made a whole bunch of really great films. It was, and they were in Whitesburg, Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, which is the next county over from Harlan County. It's the mountain divides it, and it was mainly people working there that grew up in the mountains. Most of the people that worked there had. And it was very interesting when I began working with a lot of pieces that were cultural, and then a piece about the Buffalo Creek flood and some other really fine work. And local people hadn't seen it. So my second job with Apple Shop was trying to get stuff on local television so that local people could see it. Because how do you see a 16 millimeter film?
Right.
In a movie theater? There wasn't any, at that time, there was no, there weren't even VHS tapes floating around, right? There was, Harlan County wasn't on public television until I think maybe 10 years ago or something like that. It was ridiculous. It was not allowed to be on public television. It was not on public television. So the film was really only seen in theaters at that time. It was not on television. There weren't any movie theaters except drive-ins, It didn't play in any of the drive-ins, or any of the theaters in Eastern Kentucky.
Wow.
So local people didn't see it.
Wow.
Except I think Barbara brought it down to the community center in Everts and had one screening, but one screening is not going to, that much of a remote territory. And I think probably a lot of, there's a real class base there. I don't think a lot of universities would have shown it at that time. There weren't any universities. There were occasional community colleges.
But that would show. Wow. I did not know that about that, realize or even know that it had been just that recent that public television had broadcast this film.
I mean, I might be wrong. It might be 20 years, but I think there was at least a 20-year period after that film came out where it was never shown on television.
Wow. Damn, man, I didn't even think about it like that, like how people would have reacted negatively to that, right? Because it does show some very impoverished conditions and such. Let me ask you this from my limited knowledge about unions and mining communities and such. Was it the same in Harlan County where kind of everything was done in-house with the mines, like they owned everything, that the stores, everything but was it the
Yes.
same way like in Harlan County?
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, of course, there were people that weren't, there were welfare camps that were even worse than coal camps. But, there was a pattern of ownership that was really, really very strongly coal company ownership. And in this case, an absentee owner. I mean, it was Duke Power.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, there was a local management.
Mhm.
I mean, there was a Eastover Coal, which sold to Duke Power. So
Mhm.
yeah, but it was very controlling of people's lives. You went to the company doctor, you went to the company school, you went to the, some of the coal camps were pretty fancy. I mean, you had opera houses in some of them. They were trying to educate the workforce, some of them, but a lot of them were not.
And no indoor plumbing, and of course, as the movie depicts in so many of those places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, wow. The living conditions is just terrible. I mean, and again, that doesn't change. I mean, again, if I can just refer back to Maywan, I mean, and what Sales talks about there, I mean, he's depicting some of these same things.
Right.
And nothing has changed.
Right.
Why do you think the change has been so slow in terms of developing things from mining community?
I think there were major changes when the union began, which was 30s. For one thing, there was national policy, with Roosevelt and the NRA, and there was a support for union organizing, and there were very powerful unions. And you have the whole building of the CIO, and it's a very strong labor movement. That kind of that continues through World War II, and then in the 50s there's this concerted effort, particularly in the South, to bust labor unions. You have Taft-Hartley coming in at the end of the Second World War, and then you have this attempt to revitalize the economy based on super exploitation of workers, and that's true in Texas, certainly. So you have, I think it's somewhere around 4% of eligible workers are unionized in Texas.
Man.
That's pitiful. That includes public sector.
Wow. Man.
And the reason is I know for state workers, there's no collective bargaining. It's illegal to have collective bargaining in Texas if you're a state worker. So there are no contracts for state workers. So policemen, firemen have contracts because they're city workers. But all the people that work downtown and at Health and Human Services, or the School for the Blind, or the School for the Deaf, or UT Austin, or any of those places do not have contracts.
So they're just at will, basically.
We're all at will.
All at will.
Yeah.
Man. Ooh, so y'all see why union organize, why that's important. Yeah. I'm always I'm always suspicious of people are anti-union. I'm like, why are you anti-union?
Well, there's been a lot of criticism of unions, and of course there's always some truth in a stereotype, right?
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that given the choice between non-union and union, it's a kind of a no-brainer. It's kind of at the base of what you do.
Yeah, man. It's amazing. That's insightful. So insightful to think about that, for sure. So I have one more question to ask you, but I want to open the door. And we do have a union, but I guess we can limit how we can work. Yeah, I think it is very limited. I know, for example, when I used to teach public school, there is a union, Education Austin per se, but it's very limited. And there was some rumblings about the fact that they were too closely connected to the school district. And so teachers really kind of felt like they didn't have any recourse either.
Yeah, except, it's a pretty amazing story lately, because what's happened with Education Austin is they've now got the majority of the school board is all former teachers and union members.
Mhm.
So we're going to have a decent superintendent, I think, for the first time in a long time,
Yeah, that's what
which is really exciting. I mean, yeah,
it's
it's
gonna be a shift.
great.
Yeah, absolutely. Ooh. So I'd like to open the floor to questions from our audience. We have one already here with Shireen. So go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I wonder how many people know that the University of California system, graduate students who are employed by the university system are on strike. 48,000 graduate students is the largest strike in American higher education history. And it's all because they are allowed to be unionized. They're part of the UAW, United Auto Workers Union.
Whoa.
They have quit teaching. They have quit doing their research. They are not when you have classes that are 200 plus, there are multiple graduate students who are doing the grading, who are doing basically all the work. A lot of
remember that.
Yeah. So they are on strike. They have quit this week. They're picketing every day.
Yeah, it's really exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Grad students.
And they have, we have the right to organize, and we do organize. We just don't have contracts. So it's kind of back to 30 style organizing, where you can't say to people, well, we will protect you if you join the union. Or we can say we'll fight for higher wages, but we're fighting with the Texas legislature. That's really fun. Particularly right now, it's pretty sad.
That's a battle. That is a battle.
Yeah.
For sure. Aqua?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to circle back to a point. I think it was Anne who made it. Why is it that you think that the number of unionized workers in Texas is only 4%? That just seems like laughably low.
Yeah, it's kind of, one of the things, this is just a little bit of history, but one of the things that they grew the economy in the US South. First of all, there are all kinds of workers, like migrant workers are unprotected by any kind of labor law in this country. I mean, there's a little bit of labor law that kind of applies. So there was a certain amount of racism involved, to be honest, about how labor law was created in this country to begin with. But in the late 40s, when unions were pretty powerful, there was an act passed called the Taft-Hartley Act. And what it did was it said that it limited the ability of workers to get together across work sites. So and it also is the beginning of what's called the right to work law, which means that you cannot, if you vote to have a union in a workplace, it doesn't mean that everybody's a member of the union. People have the choice about whether to join or not join, which sounds, it's all touted as right to work, and all of that nonsense. But the fact is, it's a repressive, anti-union situation. And those laws were passed throughout the South. And the idea was to develop the economy on the basis of really lousy no unions, so companies all fled south. Now they've gone really south, right? But they fled. You could see auto coming. The biggest place for US auto now is not Detroit. It's like northern Alabama. It's, there's this movement of industry down towards the south. That's why Texas has very low unemployment rates, because we're producing all this stuff down here because we have lousy workman's comp, We have lousy unemployment compensation. We have lousy health and safety.
Mm.
We have lousy wages. And the lack of organization, without a demand, nothing happens, right? So the lack of organization means that those things happen. But that was the basis on which industry was recruited. So it makes sense. I mean, employers will fight like the Dickens against it. I mean, even I'm part of the Labor Council in Austin, and even getting Tesla to meet minimal OSHA standards is like huge. I mean, things that should be automatic are a real battle here.
Wow.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Layla?
But the people that are organized are great. It's not like, I mean, they're wonderful people. And, it's kind of like Harlan County, those people that stand up are the people that you want to be part of and you want to admire. And,
Yeah. Layla? Wow. Oh, there you go.
Yes, sorry. I have a couple questions. I'm going to just ask one, and then if there's time, I'll raise my hand again. But one of them that I'm curious about is if you could speak to, I mean, this was a really long strike. It was it 13 months? Is that correct?
It may
Or
be
longer?
14. I'm
Okay.
not good at that, but yeah.
Yeah, well, nevertheless, it's a really long time for people to be without an income. And I
Mhm.
was wondering if you could speak to how the community sustained itself, and what maybe type of mutual aid efforts were integral to being able to sustain, to hold out for as long as they did, which you said was pretty essential to victory.
Sure. So one thing that happened quite a bit was, there was a strike fund from the union.
Okay.
So people did get a certain amount of money. It wasn't as much as their wages had been, but they did have some money coming in. And the wages were awful at the point when they went on strike. So it wasn't like there was a huge amount to lose. Family structure, at least at that time in Appalachia, was pretty strong. And so people, a lot of them lived in extended families. A lot of people actually, there was the coal camp life, but there were also people that lived more in outside of town. You saw the structure in Matewan, where local people might very well have their own land, or their grandparents might have their own land. And so there was a lot of family structural support, multi-generational support. A lot of the older miners who were drawing pensions, for example. Um, and Social Security. So there was a fair amount of those kinds of programs still functioning. This is also not very long after the War on Poverty, which centered in Appalachia. So there very well could be family members that had gone into trades, that had gone out of the region and were sending money home. It's not as isolated as even I have made it out to be, There were a lot of people that headed for Detroit for auto plants and stuff during, when mining was being mechanized, and those family members would send money to support families. So there was quite an intact family structure. There was also a community structure, and everybody had a garden. Everybody. A lot of people had chickens, a lot of people, so just basic survival skills were still very intact in that area. And people did share, what they grew, but everybody was growing stuff during the summer and canning stuff. So there was a kind of it's an incredible part of the country, because it's this kind of industrial in terms of communities and towns and stuff, but it's also very rural survival skills still exist there.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
Leigh, you want to go ask your second question?
Oh, well, let's see if anyone else has some questions. Surely.
Does anybody else have another question? They want to have a question they'd like to ask?
I'll tell you one funny story about that. One of the things that happened was we were, I mean, I had lived to other places, but Barbara was from New York. You know, we were kind of city people. And we went down there and we didn't really know very much at all. We were pretty scared, actually. But that's another story. But we'd sit down and people would be gracious and they'd give us, you know, food, and they'd give us coffee, always coffee. And then, you know, the conversation would kind of come to a halt, and we'd get up to leave. We'd say, you know, thank you so much, goodbye. And they'd say, don't rush off. And we'd sit down again. And this would go on. And finally, we realized that don't rush off meant goodbye, right? You know, but there was a kind of a graciousness and a politeness that's just totally against the stereotype of what, you know, hillbillies are or something, of just really welcoming you and not saying anything unkind. And, you know, yeah, it was a very good culture in a lot of ways. Damaged, but good.
Mhm.
That sounds like my grandparents saying things like, oh, don't rush off. And you're like, yeah, I'm on head on out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody, that's cool, bro. Does anybody else have a question? No? Okay. Layla, go ahead and ask your second question.
Okay, well, it's less directly about this film. When you mentioned the government's intervention on the side of the miners, it made me think about the potential for an impending railway strike with the railroad union workers, and the government's already been articulating like, well, this would be very bad for our economy, which is already struggling. And so it sounded as though you felt that the role of the government was fairly favorable. Obviously, the miners, they did get the contract, but it was still limited in terms of allowing them to strike locally in the face of future grievance. But looking at the railroad worker strike or the negotiations over a new contract, do you think that the government will play a similar role in favor of the railroad workers in this contemporary situation? If you're following
You have
that
the
story.
Biden administration. I think they're going to act like, I mean, they're going to intervene. I believe the government will intervene, and that will be seen as negative on the part of the government. But at the same time, the workers may benefit from that. You know, I mean, I think energy ought to be, I think it should be nationalized. I think energy should be nationalized. I don't think we should have private people controlling things like railroads or coal mines or anything like that, which is, you know, I guess a somewhat radical viewpoint, but a fairly rational viewpoint. But so coal miners went on strike during the Second World War. And you can imagine how the response to that one, which was immediate. You know, you need coal to build bombs and everything, right? And we're in the middle of the Second World War. And John L. Lewis, who's the head of the mine workers union at that time, said that more men had died, more American men had died in the war, in the coal mines in the first year of the war than had died at fighting. And he pulled them out on strike. And, you know, the government immediately came in and took control of the mines. And in fact, what they got out of it, among other things, was a really good insurance, health insurance and pension fund. So the mine workers really gained from that. strike. And the same thing could happen with the rail workers. I mean, it might look like, oh, no, the government is intervening because they're intervening because of business, and therefore they're intervening on the side of companies. But in fact, what could happen is, rail workers really need, we all need more money but on our paychecks, but this is a very important strike and a very legitimate strike for rail workers. And they could, honestly, they might really come out better if the government does intervene.
Wow. Mm.
And I'm not saying that I think Biden is the most wonderful president we've ever had or anything, but the fact of the matter is he does have some sense of blue collar work.
Oh.
So, and his labor department, the people that he's got working in the labor department are very good, are really good. It's like a world of difference between him and the former president.
Wow. That's interesting.
They're supporting, the way I know that is the Biden administration is actually supporting independent union efforts in Mexico, which is incredible. Like in terms of observation and making sure that things are, right.
Interesting.
It is. It really is. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's a, we'll see.
I'm like the police officer.
But I'm optimistic right now.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I feel like the police officer in the movie, like, what? Really?
I know, because we're brought up to distrust the government, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can vouch for that.
Sometimes the government does the right thing.
Sometimes. Right. Well, the last question I'd like to ask to kind of end on like the film, kind of a fun note, I guess. In the making of documentary, the making of Harlan County documentary that's on the Criterion channels I've talked about, you mentioned there that the film kind of takes place at the height of the women's lib movement. And so in referencing, there's a scene in the film, those of you who haven't seen it, where Lois Scott takes this gun out of her bra. Right. And you made the comment that you don't know which act was more liberating, taking the gun out of the bra or burning your bra.
Yeah.
So have you come to a decision about which one you think is more liberating?
Well, hopefully neither one. They're both maybe the gun. I mean, they're both somewhat symbolic gestures, but is that a good enough answer? I think
I think that'd be good. Yes, it is. They're both symbolic gestures. I was really worried about Lois taking the way she was taking that gun out of her bra. I was like, Lois, that's upside down.
It's trigger finger, yeah.
Trigger finger. She was like, just look at you got.
She knew what she was doing. It might not have been loaded, it's also possible.
Yeah. She was very like, I got this. Like Lois seemed to me like she knew exactly how to handle a gun if she needed to.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, for sure. I'm going to turn this back over to Shireen. But again,
thank you very much.
You're welcome, babe. Shireen.
Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna watch the movie again. I think the insights you share, the context will make it even more enjoyable the second time around. Got a lot out of it. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your evening with us. And we hope to see you. I think this is our last film of the semester, but we have more coming in the spring semester. Please join us. And thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And this was a fun conversation too.
Okay.
It was.
Yeah, it was really fun.
It was. Absolutely. Thank y'all.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Good evening.
Bye-bye. Bye, Layla. Bye, Shereen. See you later. Bye, y'all.
Bye.